It's the middle of June and I've not watered this plant this year. Not once, not a lick. In fact, I've not watered this ZZ plant for nearly a whole year. It must be towards the end of last summer that I actually gave it a drink. This might surprise you, to be honest it surprises me too, but this plant has to be one of the most drought resistant plants you can buy. If you're an absolute noob when it comes to houseplants, then I highly recommend the ZZ plant. It's one of the true buy it and forget it plants you can buy. But before you go off and buy one and never water it, there are a few things you should know first, because how long you can go without watering it depends on a few things. So how on earth can this plant go so long without a drink? Well, it's all to do with the massive potato-like rhizomes in the soil from which the stems sprout from. When I pull my plant out from the soil, you can see that the soil is absolutely bone dry. I mean, we're talking Saharan sand bone dry. It's so dry it's dusty. But that doesn't matter one bit because of the plant's rhizomes that store a ton of water that the stems can draw from. It takes a seriously long time for the water to deplete from these things that the stems continue to get all the water they need for such a long time. In fact, the number one killer for this plant is overwatering. Folks often don't understand the anatomy of this plant and water it like any other in their collection. Watering it once a week spells disaster. Once the rhizomes are full of water, they can't take any more on, and if the soil they're living in is wet, they start to soften, turn mushy, and then rot. This is exactly why limp stems is such a common problem for this plant. There is too much water in the rhizomes that is causing soft tissue in the stems so that they can no longer support themselves. So if you're watering yours once a week or even once every couple of weeks, you really need to stop. I probably water mine probably 3 or 4 times a year, and I've not watered it in such a long time because I wanted to see how long it can go without a drink. Turns out, a very long time. Just look at the potato-like rhizomes of my plant. They're still firm and plump even though it's been an age since they've seen any water. Looking at the stems of my plant, you can see that it's still very healthy. Apart from having lots of dirt and dust on the leaves, a true marker of neglect, all the foliage looks surprisingly zesty. Because I very rarely have to water this guy, I pretty much forget it exists, which is why it's so filthy. The tricky thing is knowing when it does actually need a drink, and for this you need to trust your instinct and look at the leaves and stems rather than relying on the moisture level in the soil. Normally, I recommend probing the soil of your plants before watering to check how wet the soil is, and only water when it's dry with either your trusty finger or a moisture meter. But this doesn't necessarily work for the ZZ plant. Dry soil doesn't necessarily mean this guy needs a drink. Instead, you need to wait for the leaves and stems to tell you they're running out of juice by turning wrinkly. The stems should feel firm and plump when you give them a squeeze. This means they have the right amount of water in them. If they feel mushy and wet, then your plant is suffering from overwatering. If they feel soft but kind of empty, then it probably needs a drink. Unbelievably, the stems of mine still feel nice and plump, even though it's been months since its last drink, so I'm probably going to wait even longer before watering it. They're pretty much all standing upright with no significant leaning to one side, suggesting they're able to support themselves, a classic sign that it's doing okay. If there was a lack of water, then the stems would be flopping all over the place because the cells would be emptying and losing vigour. The leaves on mine also look nice and plump still, with no wrinklings, so they're not suffering from a lack of moisture. The leaves act in a similar way to a J plant, in that they turn wrinkly like aging skin when they're thirsty, and this is still not happening on mine. If you're still not sure whether your plant is ready for a drink or not, then you can get it out of the pot and check out the rhizomes. The rhizomes are just like potatoes really. You can tell when a potato is past its best, becomes soft and wrinkly, and this is exactly the same here. If they're feeling like old potatoes that have been sat in the vegetable box for too long, then it's probably ready for a drink. If they feel like fresh potatoes straight out of the earth or fresh from the store, then they should be left alone. If they are wet and mushy though, then you've got an overwatering problem. So don't be shy and give them a good poke and squeeze. The rhizomes of my plant are still miraculously firm and plump, just like fresh potatoes from the store. It's clear this guy can go longer still without a drink, so that's what I'm going to do. It is really important to keep an eye on your ZZ plant and not just rely on the fact that mine is taking an absolute age to dry out. This video is just meant to show you how long they can go without water. It might well be different for you. Sure, it will need less water than lots of your plants in your collection, but as with all plant care, this all depends on your location and your climate. I live in Sheffield, and as you would have heard me say on here before lots of times, we're not blessed with the warmest weather. We're in a temperate climate with summertime temperatures temperatures just about in the low 20s and winter temperatures normally between 5 and 10 degrees Celsius. We do normally get heat waves every year, and in fact we saw record temperatures above 40 degrees Celsius last summer, which is probably around the last time I watered this plant. If you live in a consistently hotter climate than me, then you just need to check the stems and leaves more often than me so it doesn't dry out too much. Light also plays a significant role in how quickly the rhizomes will dry out. As a rule, the more light a plant gets, the more it will transpire as it uses energy for growth, and the more it will need water to support that growth. If yours is sat in front of your south-facing window and you're in the northern hemisphere, then it probably won't last nearly a year without a drink. The ZZ plant is one of the most easygoing plants you can buy because you can pretty much put it anywhere in your home and it will do fine. At the best of times, this plant is incredibly slow growing, whether you have it in bright light or in a dark corner, so don't worry if you think your plant is not growing quickly. I keep mine in my east facing dining room about 2 meters away from the window. It never gets any direct sun, and I would say this spot is medium light at best. This means that it's a relatively slow grower, maybe sending out about 3 or 4 new stems per year. If I wanted to get the best out of it, I could move it to a brighter spot and it will send out more stems and grow bushier, but I'd also need to water it a bit more often. I'm pretty happy with where it is though and how it looks. I'm not really bothered about it getting bigger, so I'll leave it where it is. You can see from the soil that my plant lives in that I keep it in a super airy mix with tons of perlite. To prevent your ZZ plant from suffering from overwatering, it's so important to have yours in a free draining soil mix that doesn't retain water for long and rot the rhizomes. I used a mixed heavy in perlite. From memory, I think it was about 1 part compost to 1 part perlite. To be honest, I think this guy could do with a repot anyway because the soil is so dusty there will be a lack of nutrients. And because I water so infrequently, I can't remember the last time I gave it some plant food. Giving it a repot into fresh compost will probably encourage it to send out new growth. Saying that though, the foliage still looks nice and deep green, doesn't appear to be suffering at all. A common thing people notice about the ZZ plant is the roots and rhizomes seeming like they want to burst out of the pot. The pot will inevitably get pretty crowded with all those rhizomes taking up so much space in the soil, and you might think it needs regularly uppotting to give the rhizomes some space to grow. This really isn't necessary though. In fact, the rhizomes prefer to be left alone and snuggled in a slightly root-bound pot so that they can continue to send out stems. Disrupting the soil and the rhizomes too often will only slow down this process. So aim to only change your plant's soil every couple of years rather than every year like for your other houseplants. For a full guide and even more information on this plant, including tips on fertilizer, pruning and propagation, then check out this video here.